The whispers of the basement. Ethan had always loved silence. He lived on the outskirts of a quiet English village, where the nights were so still that he could often hear nothing but the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. But in the past few weeks, something had changed. It started on a Thursday evening. Ethan was curled up on his couch with a book when he heard it, a faint, irregular scratching, like a fingernail trailing against a window pane. It lasted only a few seconds before stopping abruptly. He looked up from his book, listening, but heard nothing more. Probably just a branch in the wind, he muttered to himself. The next evening, it returned, but longer this time. The sound came from the hallway window near the front door. Ethan set his book down and walked over, pulling back the curtain. Nothing. Just the darkness pressing against the glass. He told himself to ignore it. Sounds come and go. He knew that. But each night, the scratching grew louder, more insistent, and began to spread. At first, it was just the hallway window, but soon he heard it at the living room windows, and then, even at the window beside his bed. A creeping unease settled in. Every night, he checked the windows, searching for an explanation. But he found nothing, no branches, no footprints, no signs of animals. Just his own reflection staring back at him, pale and tired, with dark circles under his eyes. Then the noises moved inside. Lying in bed, half asleep, he heard again, scratching, but closer now. Right next to him. It seemed to be coming from the wall beside his bed. Ethan shot upright, holding his breath. The noise stopped. He waited, heart pounding. Nothing. Imagination, he said aloud, his voice hoarse. Just my imagination. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Ethan barely slept anymore. Every night, the scratching seemed to creep closer. It was as if the house itself was waking up, breathing, trapping him inside its wooden ribs. During the day, he tried to distract himself, tending the small garden, sanding down the old shed door, rearranging his bookshelves. But as soon as dusk fell, the unease returned. One evening, as the sky burned a deep crimson, he made a decision. He would search the house. Properly. Armed with a flashlight, he moved methodically from room to room. He checked every window, feeling along the edges for cracks or gaps. He inspected the attic, sweeping the light over beams thick with dust. Finally, he climbed onto the roof, checking for loose tiles or signs of animals nesting. Everything was normal. But that night, something changed. The noise didn't start with the usual scratching. Instead, he heard something different, a wet, shuffling sound, like bare feet moving through a puddle. He lay frozen in bed, barely breathing. The sound was coming from downstairs, in the living room. Slowly, he pushed the blankets aside and reached for his flashlight. He crept to the bedroom door, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. The stairs groaned under his weight as he descended, step by careful step. The living room was silent. Too silent. Ethan swept the beam of light across the room, the couch, the coffee table, the rug. Everything was exactly as it should be. But then, as he turned toward the large window, his breath caught in his throat. A handprint, smeared across the glass, faint but unmistakable. The fingers were long, unnaturally so, stretching outward like thin, grasping claws. It wasn't a human handprint. A cold dread curled around his spine. He took a slow step backward, nearly stumbling over the edge of the table. Then he heard it. A noise. Wet, deliberate, right behind him. Ethan turned, the flashlight trembling in his grip. Something stood in the hallway. A tall, hunched shadow, its shape almost human but just wrong enough to be terrifying. Two small, deep red eyes gleamed in the darkness, like embers in a dying fire. A shiver ran through his body. His throat felt dry. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. The figure didn't move. And yet, somehow, it felt closer, like the darkness itself had carried forward. Then came the sound again, that slick, wet noise, filling the silence. Panic surged through him. He spun on his heel and bolted up the stairs, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. He slammed the bedroom door shut and shoved a heavy dresser in front of it, his hands shaking. Outside, the scratching began again. But this time, it wasn't just at the window. It was at the door. Ethan pressed himself against the wall, listening as the noise grew louder, more desperate. The wood trembled under unseen fingers, searching, clawing. And then, silence. For hours, he sat awake, waiting, his heartbeat refusing to slow. Only when the first pale light of morning bled through the curtains did he dare to move. He crept to the window. The handprint was gone. The hallway was empty. No sign of anything. But Ethan knew. It wasn't gone. It was waiting. Days passed, but the feeling of being watched never left Ethan. He kept every light in the house on after dark, but it didn't help. He barely slept, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the glass. The thing, whatever it was, had stepped back into the shadows, but wasn't gone. He could feel it pressing against the edges of his world, waiting for the right moment to return. Then, one night, he heard it again, the scratching. But this time, it wasn't at the window. It wasn't even at the bedroom door. It was coming from below. The basement. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat. He never went down there. The old wooden door at the end of the hall had remained locked since the day he moved in. The realtor had mentioned structural issues, something about an unstable foundation. But now Ethan wondered if there had been a lie. Because now, the basement was calling him. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Not the random scrapes of an animal, but something deliberate. Something trying to get out. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to leave the house, never look back. But instead, he found himself walking toward the basement door, feet moving as if under someone else's control. He reached for the handle. Cold metal met his fingers. It turned. The door wasn't locked. A stale breath of air rushed up from the darkness below, thick with damp earth and something else, something metallic, almost like blood. Ethan swallowed hard. His flashlight shook as he flicked it on and aimed it down the wooden stairs. Dust swirled in the dim beam of light. The wooden steps groaned under his weight as he descended, one step at a time. The basement was cold, much colder than it should have been. Stacks of forgotten boxes leaned against crumbling stone walls. Rusted tools hung untouched on hooks. The dirt floor was damp beneath his feet, and the farthest corner, half hidden beneath an old, moth-eaten rug, a wooden hatch. The scratching was coming from underneath it. Ethan's pulse pounded in his skull. His body screamed at him to leave, to pretend he never saw it. But something deep inside, something beyond reason, kept him moving forward. Slowly, he crouched beside the hatch. His fingers hovered over the edge. Then, before he could change his mind, he pulled open. A rush of freezing air hit him, thick with a putrid stench. A dark hole yawned beneath him, lined with ancient stone steps, descending into an abyss far deeper than any basement should be. The scratching stopped. And then, from below, a whisper. Ethan's blood turned to ice. He wasn't alone. Ethan's breath hitched as the whisper slithered through the air. It wasn't in any language he recognized, yet he understood it. A summons. A warning. A threat. His flashlight flickered, the weak beam struggling against the suffocating darkness below. The stone steps seemed to stretch endlessly into the void, disappearing into something deeper than shadow. Then, movement. A shape stirred in the blackness. Something impossibly tall and thin, its limbs folding like an insect's as it began to rise. Those same burning red eyes blinked open, twin embers in the abyss. Ethan stumbled backward, heart hammering. The thing, whatever it was, had been waiting. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices rising in a sickening chorus. The air itself felt heavy, pressing against his skin. Ethan wanted to run, but his legs locked beneath him. Then, the first step. The creature moved. Not walking, gliding. Its spindly limbs barely seemed to touch the steps as it ascended. Its fingers, impossibly long, scraped against the stone, leaving deep grooves behind. Ethan's mind screamed at him to move, but his body refused to obey. Then the whisper became words. You were chosen. The voice was wrong, both deep and shrill, a sound that seemed to curl inside his skull. Ethan gasped, his chest tight with terror. The thing reached the final step. It was here. Ethan finally found his voice. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He whispered one trembling word. Why? The creature tilted its head, considering him. Its skin, pale and stretched too tightly over its bones, barely seemed real. The house called you, it said. It needs you. The shadows around it pulsed, shifting like liquid. Ethan took another step back, his heel catching on the damp dirt floor. I don't understand, he choked out. The creature's mouth curled, not a smile, but something worse. You will. Then, the basement door slammed shut above him. Darkness swallowed him whole. Weeks later, a realtor stood outside the house, forcing a bright smile as she turned to the new buyer. It's a charming place, she said. A bit old, but solid. Perfect for someone looking for peace and quiet. The buyer nodded, unaware of the faint scratching sound coming from beneath their feet. The house had chosen again. And in the basement, where the light never reached, something waited. Something hungry.